Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me. Hope you're enjoying the day. I thought Sarah kicked it off brilliantly, so hopefully I'll do this talk justice. As you can see, I am only one person. Therefore, it is just Simon Goldsmith you're getting today. You aren't getting Christine. And what that means is you're missing out on an amazing business intelligence lead that works in my team and probably a whole load of Texas jokes that I'm just not going to do justice, so I'm not even going to try. So I'm going to do my best, but please bear in mind the vast majority of what I'm about to present here is not my work, it's the work of my team. And so they need to take full credit for everything that I talk about, unless you don't like it, in which case it's all on me. So I'll start with the metaphor that that is the basis of this talk and the squid that lost its shell. So squids used to have shells. Back in the Jurassic period, they used shells to rely on defence. They looked a little bit like ammonites for those that have wandered the beaches of Dorset and elsewhere. But as the seas became more acidic, those shells weakened and the calcium carbonate faded away, and they needed to develop other defences. It was probably kind of two goes hand in hand, right? If you kind of develop other defences, you have less need for a shell. So it's probably six of one, half a dozen the other. But it did mean that squids now have 3 new mechanisms for defence that they didn't have before. So they're able to manage their exposure, camouflage in kind of, let's not take that too literally, otherwise we go down a whole thing about security by obscurity, but right, we'll stick with exposure management. They developed agility. They can react really quickly to danger. And they've got a level of intelligence that other animals don't exhibit. So that's the kind of the metaphor that we're working with. And I'm sure most of you in the audience won't take too much to make that link to deperimeterization. So I think one of the main points that I want to get across in this talk is when we talk about deperimeterization, and I'll use the words zero trust, we think about it from a security angle. And I'll get into it I'll get into it a little bit. So going back to the early 2000s, a bunch of Brits and a bunch of Americans got together and formed something called the Jericho Forum. And they recognized that the way that the internet was taking us inevitably was down this path of deperimeterization and taking down the hard network boundaries that were protecting our organizations against cyber attackers. Unfortunately, and I say this is back in the early 2000s, right? So this is 20 plus years ago. Unlike the acidity of the seas, attackers aren't a particularly good feedback loop. It's taken probably about 20 years to realize that we've got this continuous kind of attacking against our organizations. Probably a little bit less than that if you kind of take it into account. But it's really things like ransomware and business email compromise that we're talking about this morning. It's that kind of continuous erosion of our boundaries that we take down our own boundaries, but also those attackers coming in has meant that we've got a really big security problem. So the first thing, and I think the takeaway from this slide is we've got to recognize the business imperative first. So take your security hats off. The reason that businesses are doing this, because they can collaborate together with each other. They can start to take advantage of really commoditized services like infrastructure as a service or cloud or software as a service. They can take all of those really commoditized services into their organization, and we can put data in there. They can move faster, they're more agile, and they can make the staff experience and the customer experience better. So there's all these business imperatives to do it. And my argument would be that when the Jericho Forum formed kind of 20 years ago, and then, a few years after that, they kind of declared success because they invented zero trust, they'd come up with a technology solution. And that did leave a little bit of a gap. Because without the hard shell, we're really exposed to kind of 3 evolutionary challenges. Number 1 is misaligned incentives. So I don't know how many of those in the room actually have to deal with business stakeholders on a day-to-day basis, but on the whole, business stakeholders don't put security as their number 1 objective. Unless you're a security company, most other companies will not put security as their number 1 objective. They will put as their number 1 objective improving customer experience, lowering their costs, speeding up their time to market. There's a few objectives that quite often come before security. So those incentives are something we should be worried about. How do we get the incentives to be secure aligned with the incentives of the business to move fast? Secondly, we've got this challenge around rapid and accurate and efficient response. And all three of those are really important. You can respond really quickly, but you might not respond in the right way. And it might take you a swarm of 200 people to solve a security incident. That's not particularly efficient. So getting that response really accurate and really efficient is a big challenge and depends on some foundations, which I'll cover in a minute. And then the third one I'll talk about is information asymmetry. And for those of you that have heard of maybe the market for lemons, and this is kind of an economic theory going back to the 1970s, which says that the sellers of something know more about their solution than the buyers. So the market for lemons comes from used cars. So the seller of used cars knew more about the condition of the cars than the buyers of those cars. And the contrast with the market for peaches was because you didn't know as much about the actual state of the car, you could sell a lemon for more than it was worth, but you couldn't sell a peach for what it was worth. And so the value that a seller was able to, or the incentive for the sellers to sell peaches went down and the market ended up with lemons. I'm not saying that all security solutions are lemons, but I'm saying that there is an information asymmetry there that acts against us. It also happens within our organizations. We know an awful lot more, and thanks to the talk this morning, we know an awful lot more about the tactics and the threats posed by cyber attackers. And hopefully we'll always know a little bit more than the people in the business about that, because that's our job, is to understand that threat and translate that into risk. So there's this information asymmetry that we've got to get over. And as I say, evolve or die. Hopefully you don't die. It's just you'll have to suffer some financial losses. So the challenge that I'll cover in this talk is number one is around incentives. Incentives really equals people, and people equals organization. So how do we get people aligned on those incentives and feel the accountability to act securely? And that's a kind of a trick in itself, as well as having the skills to do that, the skills to act securely as well. The second bit is around processes or operations, and that's where we get into operating models. And I'm going to suggest today a few examples of operating models that we've found really useful and give you some kind of, hopefully some useful tips on those operating models. This isn't kind of a recipe that will work for everybody, but hopefully there's some operating models that you'll all find useful and maybe help in your communication with business stakeholders and IT stakeholders and people who aren't as steep and as passionate about security as we are. I'm not going to talk about technology. So if you want to go deep into network security and talk about zero trust network access and identity security technologies, I love that stuff. But today we're going to focus on the people in the process. Okay, so we're going to apply Squid evolution to security operating models. We as a group are going to decide together whether patch and vulnerability management are an example of exposure, agility, or intelligence. And as I say, technology is a different talk. So, 3 security operations models. As I say, these are kind of 3 models that have proven useful for us and a way to kind of communicate within our own team and with the teams that we're working with so that they kind of understand what our aims are and how we're going about things. But essentially, exposure, Squid's camouflage. Again, let's not get into the security obscurity thing. It's about minimizing your exposure to cybersecurity risks. So what is the operating model that we use to collaborate with the business and with technology owners to minimize that exposure? Agility is about threat detection and incident response. So what do we use for that kind of process? And then what do we mean by intelligence? And how do we kind of get into the nuts and bolts of having good intelligence lifecycle? So start with exposure. The goal here really is both secure by demand and security by design. If you want to read more about the idea of security by demand or secure by demand and security by design, I really recommend the papers that CISA in the US are publishing on secure by demand and secure by design. Now they're talking about it more from a supplier-buyer relationship. So they're saying this is how you as an organization specify the software that you need in a way that is then built to a security standard. Really good paper on that. Very kind of business friendly in its language, but also kind of gets into the security bits that we really need to be talking about. And then the second bit, which is security by design, is a little bit more well-trodden and well understood. But again, a really good paper from CISA about how do you go about building software in a secure way from the start. Now, the operational model that we use for secure by design and secure by demand is a really simple, and this, I'm sorry, this does sound a bit kind of consultancy, Big Four stuff, but it works in kind of getting everybody on the same page, is a plan, do, check, act cycle. So from a planning perspective, we talk about, well, what are our expectations? What are our policies? What are our standards? How do we make sure that the stuff that we put in our policies and standards can actually be built and be adhered to? So there's this whole thing of, don't think about security, or don't just imagine security in your ivory tower, specify that to a bunch of engineers and say, go on, deliver it. You have to kind of have that planning exercise together. Then there's the doing of it. So you go off and experiment. We need a new security control, whatever that security control is, whether it's networks, devices, applications, email, whatever it is. We go off and experiment with that control. Does that control achieve the effect that we're trying to deliver? So, however you measure that effectiveness, you can measure it with, does it mitigate these threat tactics, techniques and procedures? Does it meet the regulatory requirement I've got to have for this control? And then you check. So you kind of come back and you verify that it's actually done what it's intended to do, and then turn that into a control that you roll out across the whole organization. And that's kind of a continuous cycle, and that's a key bit of just making it a continuous cycle. Who do we have doing this plan, do, check, act, or who do we have leading on it? It's our governance, risk and compliance team and our security engineering team. So they need to work together on that whole kind of build, operate, plan, do, check, act cycle. By the way, I'm going to give you kind of all an opportunity to kind of challenge and ask questions on it later, and I would really appreciate that. The agility. So how do we go about responding quickly and accurately? Quite a lot of you have probably heard of the OODA loop. So observe, orient, decide and act. And this is designed around a much more agile, fast response, great feedback loop approach to dealing with complexity and the chaos which kind of happens in a security incident. So the observe bit, the I in the diagram, then feeds into the orient bit. So you try and gather as much data as possible, try and collect as much information as possible about an incident. Who's affected, what devices have we got, what's the data look like, where are the applications, what networks does it sit on? All of that kind of is good contextual information to work out, actually, do I really have an incident, and how material is that incident? You then, based on all of that information, you synthesize it into, right, I've got some hypotheses around what might have happened. Go off and prove those hypotheses, and that takes you into the decide. This is how we're going to go about firstly containing the incident, and then this is how we're going to go about responding and recovering from it in the future. And that's where you get into the act piece. Who do we have looking after this? This is our cyber defense operations team. One of them is sat in the room. There we go, Martin. They operate on this life cycle pretty much on a daily basis. Some of it, and the real key here is how do we automate as much of this as possible? How do we kind of get into playbooks? Talking to that kind of efficiency point. Yes, we could answer the incident by getting all 200 people involved in technology on a call, but actually it would be a lot more efficient if we just had the 5 who really knew the key things of where the data is and who's got access to it and what it looks like's happened to it in our monitoring platforms. Then the intelligence bit. And this is kind of the crux of the whole talk. Because if you think about the squid's not able to kind of change color and blend into their background and not get spotted by predators. It's not able to respond quickly without the intelligence. So without that brain that it's developed, which came from not having a shell, it would not be able to do the things that we've been talking about in the previous 2 bits. So we look at intelligence from a intelligence lifecycle perspective. This is a pretty standard one from kind of UK military, talks about it quite a lot. First of all, you've got to direct the intelligence efforts. So what is your intelligence requirement? Namely, what's the question that you're trying to answer? And we tend to have pretty set 4 questions. What matters most to our organization? Why does it matter? So what are our critical economic functions? What are the things that if those functions aren't performing or aren't available, where do we end up kind of getting hit in the pocket, or our customers getting impacted? What are the things that are really critical to the business? And then what are the bits that underpin those critical economic functions? What is the data? What are the applications? And so that's the kind of the what matters most and why. Once we work out where is that, where does this sit on the networks? Where does it sit in our supply chain? How are the controls protected, or how are the controls set up around it? And as a result of that, where are our coverage and our gaps, and where are they not effective, and where might they be in place but not necessarily turned on and configured as they could be? So those are the questions that we input into the intelligence lifecycle. And if you don't have good questions, it's like stating the obvious, you're not going to get a really good answer out the back of it. So that determines what data do we need to go off and collect. And the collection bit is not straightforward. Sources are all over the place. Very rarely, actually, are the data sources sat in security. Quite often, the sources of the data are sat in other bits of the organization. It might be business information, it might be data about the systems, it might be the tech operations or the IT operations team that actually has the data. So it's what's the sources of the data, and how confident can we be, and how much can we rely on that data? So, and quite often we'll have to cross-validate to increase our confidence in the data and what it's telling us. Then we kind of go into the processing bit. So how do we look at the data, cross-correlate, work out what really matters, what doesn't, what's noise, what's signal, and then we can turn into a product, an intelligence product that we can then send off to the teams that need it. So sometimes those intelligence products are kind of pretty regular. They might be a report for the board once a month or once a quarter. Might be product for the cyber defense team, so that they can add some color and add some more context to their incidents. And that could kind of be, like a 24-hour demand. So time horizons on this kind of stuff is really important. And then making sure that it's kind of delivered at pace and delivered at the cadence that people can use. It's no good giving, chief executive a readout on what the systems are telling us about our exposure and where we need to invest our money in improving our security controls, and coming up with a whole load of data out the seam. So it's that kind of, what's the time horizon? The chief execs are generally worried about 3 months ahead, 6 months ahead, 18 months ahead. The incident team are worried about, what's happening today? And so getting those time horizons synced up for this intelligence cycle is really important. So going a bit deeper on the intelligence bit, as I said, it's kind of fundamental for exposure and for agility. And with me kind of prattling on for however long I've been talking, I've not been keeping track. I'd be interested in what operations model you as a group would choose for patch and vulnerability management. So maybe a show of hands, who would choose exposure as the plan, do, check, act cycle for vulnerability and patch management? Anybody would select that? We've got one. There we go. Who would choose response or agility? A few more hands. And then who would put it in intelligence? Interesting. Okay. So we'll talk about that. And then what are the intelligence requirements for incentives? And then who leads on intelligence? So it's classic. It's a security answer. It depends. So if the goal is to respond really quickly and accurately, we put it in response and we put it in agility, because this is like a planet melting vulnerability, log4j, treat it like an incident, get it into the OODA loop. You're going to have to be operating at pace, working out where this vulnerability sits in your supply chains and in all of your software. So that is, if it's that kind of press the emergency button, it goes into the intelligence workflow and becomes part of the OODA loop. If it's more of the kind of the operational side and IT hygiene type of patch and vulnerability management, you want it in kind of the IT operations space, and you want it in kind of the tech ops space. And really there, my recommendation for people in security is stay out of it. Don't get into the details of individual vulnerabilities that should just be part of the IT and admins and their teams regularly staying on top of stuff. Now, that doesn't mean you leave them alone. If they need help, you give them help. But broadly, all you should really be interested in there is a service level objective. Are you patching and are you fixing your vulnerabilities within the timescale that we've agreed is a reasonable timescale? And, if you're kind of within 90% of your patch and vulnerability service level objectives, okay, that's probably a fairly healthy number. And so you agree that, and as long as they're staying within those guardrails or those bounds, we're all good. Don't make the mistake of a lot of security teams, which is just going deep on vulnerability management because your time is better spent elsewhere, is the kind of the TLDR of that one. Who do we have looking at that? Well, if it is an incident, then that's the cyber defense operations team. One of the things that, and maybe this is kind of useful for those of you who are wondering, well, what do we do about staying on top of the exposure piece? As I say, that's kind of a plan, do, check, act cycle, but it's a bit more operational than where security engineers will often be looking. So security engineers are often looking at building security and security by design, as I say. So we've actually stood up an attack surface management squad. And what they do is look at the more operational sides of keeping the exposure at a minimum for the organization. So they look right across the piece. One day they might be looking at on-device or server. Another day they might be looking at software vulnerabilities or cloud misconfigurations. So they can kind of switch their skill sets depending on the type of infrastructure we're talking about. But the idea is they're an operational team that is helping out other operational teams to build new processes and stay on top of their IT hygiene practices. Or in pretty mature organizations, the tech ops team might just take care of it. And as I say, they just pump then an SLO, how they're doing against their service level objective back into the security team. The other key thing that I think is really important is to kind of redefine intelligence. And the reason I say that is that threat intelligence has gotten both a kind of a good and a bad name. And it is a real enabler when it comes to incident management, enriching detection and response and that sort of stuff. But that tends to be the angle that is pitched for most threat intelligence. And there's a couple of issues with that. One, threat intelligence providers do not have your context. They don't know your business. They don't know those 4 key questions that I said in the direction piece. They don't know where your most important business processes are or the tech that supports and the data that supports those business processes. And they don't really know the context for the intelligence that they're providing. So think of intelligence as both kind of understanding yourself as well as kind of understanding the outside world. And that leads you into more of a strategic use of intelligence, in my view. And we then split that out into 2 bits. So we've got a kind of a nail the basics bit of intelligence. And that's really what we call our key control indicators. So we've got 6 big risks that we worry about as an organization. We're worried about people performing an insecure action, just doing something that they shouldn't do. We're worried about insecure access, people having too much access or getting too much blast radius if an account gets compromised. We're worried about insecure applications, insecure infrastructure, compromised third parties, and detecting and responding to cyber attacks. So those are our 6 big risks. Underneath each of those, we've just got some nail the basics metrics. And that really helps us to kind of communicate and close that. When I talked about misaligned incentives, if you just give a business a really small number of key control indicators, they can focus on those. If you give them all of the controls in ISO 27002 or, the 190, whatever it is in CIS or whatever control framework you want to use, they're going to get swamped and overwhelmed and they're not really going to know what matters. If you give them kind of these key control indicators, they can get that. This is our minimum. This is essentially our minimum viable product for security. If you put them against the risks, this is what the board says we can accept in terms of really measurable things. Also kind of, if you phrase it that way, as I say, insecure infrastructure or insecure applications, it's something that we can do about as a business. If you phrase your risks entirely in kind of threats might ransomware us or they might business email compromise us, sometimes boards can feel a little bit helpless. Okay, but what do you want me to do about it? I can't do anything to kind of control or influence the behavior of attackers. We can get into a side conversation about deception, but then I'm definitely taking them down the rabbit hole. Bring them back to stuff that they can really control and do something about. It's the stuff that we build, the stuff that we manage. again, even like the insecure actions thing, you can't control your behaviour of your people. You can influence them and you can invest in helping people to act more securely. So those nail the basics. And then the other bit that we do is we look at how do we start supplying the evidence that security is there, and, pick a control framework, as I say, ISO 27002, could be any of them. How do we start supplying the evidence that those controls have got good coverage and are effective on a much more continuous basis? And that's kind of a key bit of this kind of intelligence cycle, is making that more continuous. We're kind of at the beginnings of what a few people have called GRC engineering. Sets a few people's teeth on edge, because people like to think, well, I'm either an engineer or I'm in governance, risk and compliance. This is kind of this hybrid thing now of the technology can start telling that story around governance and risk and compliance and policy is you might have heard policy of code. You might have heard a whole load of other ways that the technology can start providing machine readable evidence that security controls are there. And so GRC engineering is kind of a term to look at, have we put the policy in code? Have we got the security that we say we need? And can we provide that evidence in a really machine readable way, rather than having armies of people walking around the business, asking questionnaires, taking up everybody's time with security assessments? Right, this is the bit I'm just not going to do justice, because Christine's way better than me, and she talks about this from first-hand experience. So just pretend I'm a business intelligence person who has joined a security team. She's given us a few gotchas here, and this is kind of key for your data people. You're in security now. Don't cut corners. I love that she put that one down first. Security rarely own the data sources, so building those relationships with the people who own the data and making sure that kind of collection plan is really well described and you have some confidence in it is really key. She put in another thing which I thought was super interesting, is quite a lot of security tools will present a dashboard or have some sort of user interface, which is really useful, but the API will serve up completely different data. It's almost like the security vendors look at the dashboard and say, the person reading this doesn't understand security, so I'm going to give them a really good context, really kind of good in-depth view of what this tool is telling us. But the person reading the API is a security person, doesn't need that kind of wrapper. And that's actually not always the case, because, as I say, we've got data engineers and data analysts in here. So I think that was an interesting piece. Partnering is really critical, and making sure that you're managing up and across the business and with everybody, that's all of the stakeholders. Top tips: let the data lead the way, build mutual respect and trust. Don't use the data to beat teams up. Make sure that that's a mutual thing. And nip the kind of the data is wrong in the bud. The first reaction to data is quite often to go question the data quality. If you view it as a collaborative thing, that you're building that data picture together, that's less likely to happen. And also, even if it does happen, you've both then got a stake in fixing it. So, in summary, it's inevitable. Boundaries have dissolved. We don't have our shells. For some of us, you can join, and present, I'm not speaking from experience here, definitely. There is no security before the security team arrives. But you have to bear in mind the reason why businesses are doing this, and they're doing it to collaborate more, to integrate better with their partners, move faster, all of that kind of good stuff. Hopefully I've convinced you that a squid analogy kind of works, and maybe as a way to talk to your business stakeholders and your own security folks about something which previously, as I say, Zero Trust is quite technology oriented. Thank you very much. As I say, credits to my team. Thank you.
If you're okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Going to be around for the rest of the day as well.
Yep.
Well, we've got 2 minutes, so I'm going to have to pick one point. Let's see you first.
As a more technical minded person, I'm wondering how the collaboration between businesses on an intelligence sharing way works. Do you have like ironclad contracts where they define what you can and cannot give out?
It really depends on the industry vertical, in my experience. So like the sector, some sectors have a really mature ecosystem when it comes to intelligence sharing. So FSI ZAC is quite a famous example. Financial services has an information sharing body where those contracts are quite well established and are quite explicit. Other industries, it's WhatsApp. So it does really vary on your organization and the vertical you're in. What I would say, my experience of kind of that intelligence sharing, yes, it's things like who's attacking us and what are the TTPs and all of that sort of stuff. But it's also about it's great to share intelligence about how you've solved security problems. And quite often that's less about a contractual agreement and NDAs and all that sort of stuff. And it's actually just security peers talking to each other. This event is great for stuff like that. So I think combination of the formal, contracted and informal is my kind of answer to that one, I think.
All right, thank you.
You got any time?
So we probably get one, yeah.
One more. Did I see that hand up in the space?
No one else does. I have a follow-up.
Go for it.
So, how you said that it's very important to share the solutions that you found to security problems. How do you share the solution without giving away those 4 core questions that you need to figure out about your company? Because a solution isn't going to mean as much without the context, like you said. How do you strike the balance between giving too much away and not giving enough away?
I think we often overstate how secret our secret source is, as defenders. So I'll give you 2 examples. One, there's a whole bunch of frameworks out there around MITRE ATT&CK, if you've heard of it. And MITRE ATT&CK then has MITRE DEFEND. What are the ways that you can defend against those attack tactics? Then MITRE DEFEND can map to control frameworks, and those control frameworks can then map to security solutions. Quite often, an internal team will have built that logic of TTPs all the way down to solution. None of that is particularly secret source. It's hard work, and it kind of is personal kind of intellectual property, but there's no real reason we can't share that more openly and go into kind of open source around that kind of logic that I think provides a whole load of value to the community. There's another kind of example that I'd use of quite often when you're looking at control reporting and controls monitoring, your problem is what's your denominator? Let's take devices. How many devices do I have in an organization? Unbelievably hard questions to answer for large organizations. And how many of those devices have got EDR on it, have scanned for vulnerabilities, are within patching policy? That is a data problem. How you go about solving that data problem using the plan, do, check, act cycle, again, is something that I can share pretty freely without worrying about sharing any kind of particular vulnerabilities of our organization.
All right, that makes sense. Thank you.
Nice one. And so let's put our hands together again and thanks Simon for the time.